Hello, hello, welcome. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this evening. So good evening, everyone. My name is Chelsea Savage. I'm the class of 2021, and I'm the Assistant Director for Early Engagement with the Office of Alumni and Family Engagement.
Hi, all. I'm Serena Sewell. I'm class of 2019. I'm the Assistant Director of Annual Giving with the Fund for Davidson. Please make sure to direct all questions to me in the chat.
We're thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome each of you to the class of 2008 sponsored Back to School class featuring Nick DiLuzio. Before we get started, I want to go over a few Zoom keeping items. First, all participants have been muted and will remain muted throughout the event. If you are comfortable and have not already changed your Zoom name to your first and last name, we ask that you do so now. You can rename yourself by clicking the Participants button at the bottom of your screen, hovering your mouse over your name, and then clicking the More button. Feel free to add your Davidson class year if you have one as well. The chat feature is available. If you have questions for Nick during the presentation, please send them through the chat to Serena or myself. We will share them with Nick during the formal Q&A period at the end. At the end, we will also offer an opportunity for participants to unmute and ask questions directly to Nick. Please note that Nick will not be monitoring the chat, so please do not send questions directly to him. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. For optimal viewing, we recommend hovering your mouse at the top of the black Zoom screen and you will see View pop up. If you click on that and then select Side-by-Side Speaker View, you will be able to see all of the speakers at the center of your screen and the speaker to your right. In addition, we have enabled live audio transcription for this call. If you would like to enable this on your end, you can hover over the live transcription button on your screen and subtitles should appear. Please note that captions are not always accurate, so we ask for grace and understanding. And again, I want to reiterate that if you have a tech issue, please send the chat to Serena. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Nick DiLuzio.
Great. Thanks, Chelsea. Thank you all for joining this evening. I see a couple more people trickling in. Yeah, so I'm excited to talk a little bit tonight about fire and fire in the Southeastern forest. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Hopefully y'all can see that. Perfect. All right. So again, I'm Nick DiLuzio. I'm a proud graduate of the class of 2008 from Davidson College. And just to give you all an overview of what I'm going to touch on tonight, I'm going to start with a little bit of intro about me, since this is a group of fellow Davidson alumni, talking a little about my time at Davidson and how I ended up in forestry. Give a really quick kind of one-slide overview of the Georgia Forestry Foundation, the organization that I lead, and then I'll jump into some basics on wildland fire, a brief history of fire management, the importance of fire as a management tool, and then wrap up by talking a little bit about kind of comparing and contrast fires in Georgia and the Southeast versus what we see out west on the news. And that career opportunities in forestry is left over from a different talk, so ignore that. Unless anybody is interested in going into forestry, let me know. So a little bit about me. Again, I mentioned that I'm a graduate of the class of 2000, a member of the class of 2008 from Davidson. While I was at Davidson, I did a lot of different things, as I'm sure everybody on this call did. I spent 3 years doing research in the herpetology lab, and so that's a picture of me that you can see with we were doing some work with Burmese pythons from the Everglades that would get quite literally FedExed up to Davidson, and we'd do surgery on them and then ship them back down to the Everglades. So I spent 3 years in the herpetology lab, and then also for 2 years that I overlapped with in the ornithology lab with Dr. Mark Standback. So spent a lot of time outdoors in research. Always had an interest in the environment. And I also played was on both the football and track teams while I was at Davidson. So like every other biology major, I started pre-med. Clearly that didn't work out because here we all talking about fire. And so once I dropped pre-med, or it kicked me out, I was trying to figure out, what do I do? I have an interest in the outdoors and the environment. And one of my other professors at the time, Dr. Pat Ferroni, did her PhD work at Duke University and told me about the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke. So after I graduated from Davidson, I went on to the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University for grad school. I ended up doing a dual master's program where I earned a master's in forestry and a master's in environmental management. So I really kind of stumbled into forestry. I was there doing primarily the MEM degree, which is the primary degree of the Nicholas School. While I was there, I realized I could add a Master of Forestry degree, and it was only an extra semester. And so that sounded like a pretty good deal, and forestry sounded cool and interesting, and I thought it'd be fun. So I tacked it on and fell in love with it. And so while I was also at Duke, I earned a certificate in geospatial analysis, so GIS, computer mapping type stuff. And a lot of my work and my research that I did at Duke focused on longleaf pine ecosystems and fire and endangered species. And so the picture that you'll see here is from Southeastern North Carolina, where I was doing a lot of my thesis work focused on longleaf pine habitat restoration and red-cockaded woodpeckers, an endangered species across the Southeast. And so you can see, if you, hopefully you can see my cursor, but up a little bit above me on this tree, that kind of white spot with a little hole in it, that's a nest cavity for a red-cockaded woodpecker in this longleaf pine tree. So I spent some time out with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service banding little baby woodpeckers. But that's kind of how I fell in love with forestry and fell in love with the fire. Ended up getting my red card, which is the wildland firefighter certification, and kept that up for a couple of years until I got tired of doing the annual fitness test. So I dropped that, but I still love fire. So now I lead the Georgia Forestry Foundation. So we're a nonprofit organization. You can see our official mission statement there, but we work to ensure the long-term sustainability of Georgia's 22 million acres of working forest. And kind of at its core, we work to keep forest land as forest land across the state of Georgia. And we do that through programs focused on 3 different areas. Kind of the bulk of what we do is education and outreach, educating people, especially Atlanta, where I'm based and where I grew up, but people all across the state about the importance of forests and forestry to the state, and that, sometimes it's okay to cut a tree down. We don't want to cut every single tree down, but for Georgia's pine forest, which makes up the majority of forestry, it's okay to cut a tree down because we're going to go back and plant 3 or 4 more trees back in its place and keep doing that over and over again. We have some programs focused on environmental sustainability, really focused on water, carbon, and wildlife, and then economic competitiveness, ensuring that Georgia continues to have a healthy forestry economy and a forest products market. So a couple key facts about Georgia's forests. Georgia has about 24 million acres of forest land across the state. 22 million acres of those are privately owned. And that's typical really all across the East Coast and the Eastern US. The East Coast, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but the Eastern US is predominantly privately owned. And then as you get further west, it transitions to more public ownership and less private ownership. And that's important when we talk about some management implications down the road. Georgia, we are the #1 forestry state in the country. So the 22 million acres of privately owned forest we have is more than any other state in the country. We harvest more volume annually than any other state in the country, but we plant more trees than most countries in the world. So every year, on average, Georgia plants between 250 and 300 million trees every single year, just in Georgia. So it's the second largest industry in the state of Georgia behind poultry. But our forests are at threat. So we lose on average 118,000 acres of forest land every year. And that's primarily due to conversion, primarily due to development. There's also some conversion to ag and other uses. And so I work every day to make sure that we keep those 118,000 acres as forests and fight the conversion that we're seeing. So the pie charts you see on the left just kind of give you an overview of ownership of the forest across the state on top, and then on the bottom, forest types across the state. So the planted pine that you'll see that it's about 25%. That's the really kind of heavily managed, highly productive pine timberland, primarily in middle and South Georgia. So if you're driving anywhere from not just rural Georgia, but anywhere really throughout the Southeast, and you see all these pine trees planted in perfect rows, that's a planted pine or a pine plantation. So that's, pretty intensively managed, but also highly productive land. We have about 25% of our forests are upland hardwood. And then the remaining 50% roughly is kind of a mix of oak pine, natural pine, and bottomland hardwoods mixed in. All right, so transitioning to fire, the main event for tonight. And a lot of what I'm talking about is going to be in the context of Georgia. That's where I live and that's where I work. But the ecology is really the same across the entire Southeast. So when I say Georgia, kind of that you could sub in Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Mississippi, any other state, and it would still hold true. So why are we talking about fire tonight? Why am I talking about fire? For a couple reasons. So a lot of ecosystems in the South depend on it. It's an important, if not, and I would argue the best management tool available to foresters. It's a hot topic, pun intended, especially out west. It's a good thing almost all the time. And I love fire. It's awesome. So it's something that I love to talk about. So the picture here, I don't know if any of my football teammates are on. This is one that I debated including given the chance that they could be on tonight. But that's definitely a very much a posed photo that I took while I was at Duke with a real fire, prescribed fire going on behind me in the Duke forest. So kind of set some terminology as we start working through this presentation. So there's a couple different types of fire: a surface fire, ground fire, and a crown fire. Surface fires, those are cool and quick. So they're relatively low intensity and they burn through pretty quickly. So when we talk about a prescribed burn in the Southeast, that's typically going to be what you want it to be as a surface fire. It'll clear out the kind of the leaf litter, small brush, and that's about it. Ground fires are also low intensity, but they're much slower burning. And so they might sit there and they can smolder, they can burn for months at a time. You may not know it, especially in areas of really thick humus or peat layers. If there's a really thick organic layer, a ground fire can sit there and kind of burn through that entire organic layer until it gets down to mineral soil. And then a crown fire is what you see a lot out west. And so when you see those crazy wildfires out west, that's a crown fire. It's a fire that started on the ground, might have started as a surface fire, but eventually the intensity got high enough and the flame height got high enough where it moved from the ground into the mid-story and all the way up into the canopy of trees. And so a crown fire will go through and it'll take out everything in its path. And then when we talk about fire, we also talk about growing season versus dormant season, especially when we talk about prescribed burning. So growing season is when you do a prescribed burn during just that, during the growing season, spring to summer. Dormant season burns, which are most common, is when you'll do a burn in the fall and winter when most plants are dormant. There's advantages and disadvantages to both, and so kind of depending on what your management objectives are, what you're trying to accomplish with the burn will dictate if you do a growing season burn versus dormant. Dormant is much more common, it's easier, it's less risky. With growing season, you've got a lot more biomass on the ground, and a lot more chance for something to happen and for it to get out of control. Another really important concept in fire is the fire return interval in a fire regime. And so this relates to the spatial and the temporal patterns of fire, and then also the impact and the severity of fire. So there's really two factors that determine the fire interval and the fire regime in an area: vegetation type and weather and climate patterns. And so no matter where you are in the country, your area has a fire regime. And the fire return interval is just the average number of years between fires in a representative stand. So in the map on the left of the slide, where you see the light blue really all throughout the Southeast, that's a understory fire. So there's low intensity, kind of cool and quick fires every 0 to 10 years. And there's some variability, even further variability within the states. So you can see the South, really all across the entire Southeast, we have a pretty frequent fire return interval every 0 to 10 years. If you look up in the kind of the far Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Washington, you see those pinks and purples. So those are stand replacement fires every 200 to 500 years. So if you think of, what you think of Seattle and Portland in that region, it's wet. It gets a lot of rain. A lot of that is, kind of temperate rainforest up there. So they don't have fires often, but when they do, they're big and they're extreme. And that's also natural. So every 200 to 500 years, fire comes through, kind of wipe out everything, hit the reset button, and that process starts all over again. So wherever you are in the country, you can kind of look to see what your fire return interval is. And you can see a lot of California is also in that really frequent understory fire every 0 to 34 years, which we'll touch on that a little bit later. So zooming in here a little bit more on Georgia and the Southeast, it's a little hard to see. The colors might be hard to make out, but hopefully you can see kind of a little bit of a line as we move here throughout the Southeast. This is the fall line, so transition from coastal plain to the Piedmont. And you can see down in the coastal plain throughout the Southeast, it's really that dark blue, so 0 to 5 year return interval. And really most places in the Southeastern coastal plain have a 1 to 3 year fire return interval. So on average, every 1 to 2 years, naturally there's a fire that goes through that stand. As we transition up into the Piedmont to Atlanta, and then where Davidson is, we still have pretty frequent fires. Instead of every 1 to 3 years, it might transition to every 6 to 10 years. But if you think about North Georgia, kind of central western North Carolina, it's still fairly frequent fires coming through, but low intensity fires. And so because of the frequency of fires in the Southeast, especially in the coastal plain, with a fire coming through on average every 1 to 2 years, there's a lot of species have adapted and are now dependent on fire. So I mentioned earlier, kind of the longleaf pine that I did my work on, and those are some little baby red cockaded woodpecker chicks that you see in my hand there. So that's kind of one of the keystone fire species. Longleaf is absolutely dependent on fire, and we've seen a pretty significant decline in longleaf throughout the Southeast due to the removal of fire from the landscape. And the longleaf is my favorite tree. It's also the state tree of North Carolina, so I'll touch on that a little bit. And so what the picture you'll see on the left is a little baby longleaf pine in what's called the grass stage. And so when a longleaf pine, when a seed or a seedling sprouts, it'll stay in this grass stage for up to 7 years. And it's all it will be for, the first 7 years of its life is this little tuft of needles on the ground. It can be hard to see if you don't know what you're looking for. But what it's doing during that time, longleaf needs sandy soil to grow. And so it's sitting in this little tuft while it's growing its taproot straight down, as far down as it can go to reach water. And all the while, the needles here on the surface are protecting the little tiny tip in the middle. It's called the apical meristem. So if the tip gets damaged, then the tree will either be deformed or it won't grow. And so the needles serve to protect that tip, the tip of the apical meristem. And so as a fire comes through, the needles might burn and singe. It'll protect the tip. The needles will regrow, and it'll keep doing that for 7 years. After up to 7 years, longleaf will then enter the rocket stage. So the picture you see on the right is some younger longleaf kind of entering that rocket stage, and that's a period of really quick vertical growth. So it'll go 7 years of almost no vertical growth, and then all of a sudden it'll shoot up a couple feet, and at that point it's trying to get above the flame height. So it'll shoot up, 3, 4, maybe 5 feet to get above the height of the flames to protect, again, still protecting that tip, because that's really what drives growth. And so once it gets high enough and kind of above that normal flame height, then it'll start lateral branching out and then keep growing. So it's a pretty cool, I think it's a pretty cool tree, a pretty cool story. And without fire, because it spends 7 years in this little tiny tuft of grass, other species like oaks and sweet gums and even loblolly pine can come in and quickly outgrow and outcompete those little baby longleaf seedlings. So longleaf is definitely the one that is kind of thought of the most with fire, but there's a lot of other species that are dependent on fire. So the bobwhite quail that you see up left, a lot of times that's called the firebird, because it also depends on fire habitats that are those open understories. A lot of it tends to be longleaf. Pitcher plants depend on fire. Several orchids depend on regular fire. The gopher tortoise is another kind of keystone fire species that a lot of times you think about. Then the indigo snake is that one kind of in the bottom middle, which also depends on these primarily longleaf type ecosystems. So fire is really important to maintaining all these habitats and species. And so now a lot of these species and habitats are threatened because of the removal of fire. So I'll touch a little bit on some history of fire. And there's a professor and an author, if you're really interested in fire, and especially the history of fire, Stephen Pine has done a lot of great work about the history of fire in the US. So this is a quote I pulled from one of his books that says, humans captured fire some 1.5 million years ago and have enjoyed a species monopoly over fire's manipulation ever since. And so that's really, like now we control fire, and that's both good and bad. And so Native Americans have kind of long been known for their widespread use of fire. And so they would burn grassland areas every 1 to 3 years, and brush and forest would be burned every 7 to 10 years. So a lot of that mimicked kind of what the natural fire regime in that area was. When European settlers first arrived, they continued the use of fire. And then around the turn of the century, from the 1800s and the 1900s, there was a really extensive logging across the Southeast during that time. And so when they would log, they'd pile up all the slash or the limbs and the brush and anything that they didn't use into these slash piles, and they would burn the slash piles. Burning the piles got out of control, and so you start all these wildfires. And so around, the turn of the century in the 1900s, we saw, really significant growth in harvesting and lumber production. And then we also saw, as a result, pretty significant growth in wildfires. And so in the early 1900s is when we transitioned into a period of, instead of using fire, we transitioned to suppressing fire. And a lot of that, was because of the U.S. Forest Service. And so in the early 1900s, the U.S. Forest Service adopted a policy of total fire suppression. And that was primarily in response to several large fires they had out west. So in 1935, they implemented the 10 a.m. rule that said any fire started should be or must be suppressed by 10 a.m. the following day. And then Smokey came out in 1944, and foresters have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with Smokey, because when he first came out, he was really anti any and all fire. And Smokey was used to deliver the Forest Service fire prevention message. So along with policy, they started ramping up funding. You can see federal funding grew from $5 million in 1930 to $18 million in the 1960s towards fire suppression. State funding also grew significantly during that time. And as a result, burning, both natural and prescribed, decreased significantly. So in 1930, we had about 2 million acres of timberland burned across the Southeast. And then in 1983, that dropped to just about 280,000. So pretty significant reduction. But again, talking about the kind of fire regime and fire return interval, fire is a natural part of many ecosystems across the country. And so excluding fire, one, was really not practical. It was getting very expensive to do. 1994, they almost spent close to $1 billion in fire suppression funds in the U.S. But it was harmful to forest health. All the species that were dependent on fire was removed. It wasn't being replaced with anything else. And so we're losing longleaf pine and bobwhite quail and indigo snakes and orchids and pitcher plants and gopher tortoises and all that stuff. So in 1995, there was a joint federal policy launched between the Department of Ag and Interior to restore fire to the lands and shift a lot of the responsibility to the states and other cooperators. And so since the role of prescribed fire and fire management has increased, and prescribed fire reduces the risk and the hazard of major wildfires, but it still has a lot of challenges. So that's the history. So kind of where we're at now in terms of fire as a tool. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that fire, in my opinion, and opinion of many foresters, is the most effective tool that foresters have in their tool belt. So fire can do all the things that you see listed here. It reduces fuel load, so any debris that's built up on the forest floor, all that, if it dries out, is fuel. So regular fire will reduce that. It minimizes insects and disease. It helps prevent invasive species. They're not fire adapted, so fire can take out a lot of the invasives that we're dealing with. It's great for habitat. It releases nutrients back to the soil. It reduces competition of other trees, giving you bigger and better trees, and then it can be used to prepare sites for planting after a harvest. And maybe most importantly, more increased use of prescribed fire leads to fewer extreme wildfires. And so just to give you a sense of how important fire is, this is a picture from a property in kind of East Georgia, or sorry, no, this is kind of Southern Georgia. And what I'm doing here is I'm standing in the same spot, just took the photo on the left. This is a stand that's burned every 2 to 3 years. It's due for burning. You can see how kind of tall and thick some of the underbrush is getting. So it's due for another burn. And then I turned around, same exact spot, and took a shot of the stand across the street. So same exact property, a couple 100 feet, if even that, away from each other. So the one on the left is burned regularly. The one on the right is not. So you can see on the left, it's really open understory. You've got a nice herbaceous layer. On the right, you've still got, pretty thick stand of pines, but you see a lot of mid-story and really thick understory species coming in. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how much of a difference fire can make in a stand. And then this is a picture on another property in Middle Georgia. The landowner manages this part of the property for quail. But he's working to restore a natural quail population in the property, and so he burns this tract every other year. And so you get, kind of the nice open pine with the grass and herb open understory, which is exactly what quail want. And so, fire is the best tool available, but without fire, you still have to do something. Since especially in the Southeast, our ecosystems are adapted and dependent in many cases on fire. So if man remove fire from the ecosystem, that has to be replaced by something. And the something that can be replaced with is either chemical treatment or a mechanical treatment. And both can be effective. They're not nearly as effective as fire, and they're a lot more expensive to implement. So fire really is the best tool out there. And a lot of people in Georgia and across the Southeast are really working to restore prescribed fire and increase the use of prescribed fire across the landscape. So there's still, I mentioned there's still some challenges. Maybe the biggest one is perception. A lot of people still think of fire as a bad thing. They see the news stories of all the fires out west and everything going up in flames. And so people think of any fire as bad. Fire certainly can be bad, but not all of it is bad. Smoke is a challenge, especially if you're burning near a town or near a highway. You don't want to smoke out an interstate or smoke out a road. There are still some local ordinances, I know, at least in Georgia, that we're fighting kind of around fire. Burn bans are a big one. Georgia's burn ban just went into effect yesterday across a lot of most of North Georgia. And so that kind of reduces the amount of burning that can be done. And then, as I mentioned, the proximity of roads, highways, or other development can also be a challenge when you're using fire. So it's getting easier to do, at least in the Southeast, but there are still some challenges. And as I just get close to wrapping up here, I want to contrast a little bit about fires in Georgia and the Southeast versus what we see out west. And if anybody's on here from California or the West Coast, I'm going to apologize in advance. I might poke a little bit of fun at California, but there are some pretty significant differences factor into what we're seeing on TV. So in Georgia, and again, this is holds true throughout the Southeast, Georgia averages over 2,300 wildfires annually, and most other states across the Southeast have that similar number. The difference is, because of how Georgia's forests are managed, the average size of the fires that we do have are 7 acres of the wildfires, 7 acres or less. So they're small, and a lot of that's due to how we manage our forests in the Southeast. We do thin, we do harvest, we do prescribe burning. And so that helps keep the size of the fires down, and it helps people like the Georgia Forestry Commission and other state agencies fight fires. So here in Georgia, we have the commission is our state agency, and their kind of #1 mission is wildland firefighting and fire prevention. And so they do a lot to assist landowners with prescribed burning. They'll help landowners put in fire breaks and really manage their land. And other state agencies or commissions across the Southeast do the same thing. And so, we do have a lot of fire, both natural and prescribed in Georgia and the Southeast. About 75% of all prescribed burning that happens annually is done in the Southeast. I mentioned earlier that Georgia, we're the #1 forestry state in the country. We are #2 for prescribed burning. So Florida well outranks any other state in the country. So they burn about 2 million acres a year. Georgia, we average just over 1 million acres a year in prescribed burning. So when you think about wildfire out west, this is a quote from the U.S. Forest Service last year. So there's a lot of issues contributing to the massive fires that we see out west. The biggest is climate change, but also forest management plays into it, and then the WUI, the wildland urban interface, is also plays into that. So what's causing or what's driving some of the really serious fires that we see out west? The biggest is probably climate. So the climate out west, especially California and elsewhere, is getting warmer, it's getting drier, and it's getting windier. All those factor into bigger, more intense fires. Forest management practices is a big one. So because of the ownership difference out west, where it's primarily public ownership versus private in the east, it makes it a lot harder to harvest timber, harvest trees. And so because of that, there's a lot of older trees standing especially in US forest, state and federal forest land. And as those trees get older, they die, they fall, and they just kind of build up on the forest floor. And that ultimately leads to a higher fuel load. And then because of that high fuel load, coupled with the climate, it's really hard to do prescribed burning out west. So they don't have nearly as much prescribed burning as we do in the Southeast. And I'll touch on that a couple of points down. And then I already mentioned that the land ownership, and then the WUI, the wildland urban interface, is a really important one. So when you think of areas around LA or Napa and Sonoma, the wine country, where we had a couple big fires a couple of years ago, there's homes, really expensive homes in the hills up outside of LA and the hills all throughout Napa and Sonoma. But that's an area that has a 1 to 5 year fire return interval. So, and it's a challenge when you build anything in an area that has a frequent fire return interval. Fire and homes or buildings don't really get along. And so there's some challenges created there. And liability is a big one, especially when it relates to prescribed burning. So in Georgia and most other states in the Southeast, if you go through the training to become a certified burn boss, which it's not all that complicated, it doesn't take much, but if you go through the training to become a certified burn boss, and then you do a burn, you do everything right, you follow all the steps, you submit your permit or your notice to the state, you do a burn and it gets out. Burn bosses in Georgia and most other states in the Southeast are not personally liable if a fire gets out or a fire escapes. That liability protection does not exist out west. So if somebody in California if a burn boss in California goes out and they lead or they do a prescribed burn, and that burn gets out, the fire escapes, then they are liable for the damage. And so, if I was burning out west, I wouldn't want to take on that liability because of everything else I touched on, the climate, the higher fuel loads. There's a greater risk of that fire getting out and getting out of control. So liability is an important one there. And then air quality issues as well make it hard out west to do prescribed burning. So there's a lot of challenges, but the U.S. Forest Service is at least starting or attempting to work on it. So in January of 2022, the Forest Service announced a new 10-year strategy to confront the wildfire crisis. And recently, the federal government especially has been pouring money into wildfire, especially wildfire out west. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure law, all this has billions of dollars targeted towards high risk fire sheds out west. And a lot of that's focused on doing fuels reduction and forest health treatment. So they can't really get in there with fire now. So they're going in with mechanical treatment, and they're going in with chippers and massacators and chipping up dead fuel on the ground to try and reduce those fuel loads so they can eventually get prescribed fire back on the landscape. So it's these numbers that you see in the acreages are kind of a drop in the bucket, but it's a start, and there's a lot more, still a lot more that needs to be done. So as I wrap, couple kind of key takeaway points. Fire's essential to the long-term health and sustainability of all forests across the Southeast. And there's a number of plant and animal species in the South that depend on regular fire for survival. And so, we had fire was removed from the landscape for many decades, almost 100 years. And so now there's a lot of work underway, especially across the Southeast, to reintroduce fire to the landscape and restore the landscape to what it used to be. And all of the active forest management that we do across the Southeast, harvesting, thinning, prescribed burning, all of that helps prevent major wildfires like what we see out west. And lastly, fire is one of the best tool for land and foresters, and it's a good thing. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions from the group.
Thank you so much, Nick. I definitely learned a lot. There's a question in the chat that I want to go ahead and highlight. There's a question regarding the makeup of forest ownership within Georgia. If much of the forested land is owned by private individuals and businesses, how does the Georgia Forestry Foundation go about prescribing controlled burns, or just encouraging / allowing fires, to progress? Is it something that you work with local / state officials? And has this become more difficult or easier in the Southeast as people have watched the wildfires in California?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I maybe should have mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we are the foundation. We are the nonprofit arm of the Georgia Forestry Association. So the association is the kind of the industry trade group, membership-based organization for the forestry sector in Georgia. So the association has about 2,000 members across the state. And then the foundation, we're the nonprofit arm. The easiest way to describe it is the association focuses on advocacy and policy. They're at the state capitol lobbying during the legislative session every year. And my role at the foundation, I focus on education and outreach, and I do the fun stuff. So we work with our members. Thankfully, most landowners in Georgia understand the importance of fire and prescribed fire. And so, working with landowners to get fire back on the ground isn't that great of a challenge here in the state. There are still some landowners that are reluctant or hesitant or have a hard time, if they own land more in the metro Atlanta area, it might be harder for them to burn. But we do an annual event in February where we ask our membership to come to Atlanta, which most of our members hate doing. But we ask them to come to Atlanta for a day for our Forestry Day at the Capitol event. So it's a day for all of our members to come and show their elected officials the importance of forestry. And this year, I had several of our attendees complaining to me because it was a perfect day to be burning, and they would much rather be out burning than coming to Atlanta for our event, but they did anyway. So with our membership, most of them understand the importance of fire and are working to get fire back on their land. The Georgia Forestry Commission, they do a lot of that work to help landowners get fire back on the ground. We're working on pursuing some grant funding where we can provide some cost share financial support to help landowners get fire back on their property, or go through burn boss training so they can burn it themselves. The bigger piece of probably what I do is more focused on kind of the non-forestry community in Georgia, and making sure, just like we want to make sure people understand the importance of forestry in the state, and that, sometimes it's okay to cut a tree down. We want to make sure people understand that prescribed fire and fire is a good thing when done right. And so a lot of, the talks that I give this talk fairly often, and it's always to non-forester groups, because I'm trying to build and increase that awareness of fire, and that, it's okay, and doing these prescribed fires helps prevent more serious wildfires down the road.
Thank you so much. There's another question in the chat. It says, are most of the landowners you work with for prescribed fire private landowners versus timber companies? Are timberland companies owners, companies / owners working on prescribed fire? And if so, are there any legislative tax incentives to promote prescribed fire for these large companies / landowners?
Yeah, so I'd say it's really all of the above. And so when you think about, that 90% roughly of forest land that's privately owned, that chart I showed earlier, I mean, that private ownership can be the largest landowner in the state of Georgia is Weyerhaeuser. So they own the most land of anybody in the state. Rainier is another kind of corporate or institutional landowner. There's a lot of timber investment organizations that own, hundreds of thousands of acres and across the state, and manage it as an investment for their clients. And then it can trickle down all the way down to, there's some well-established families and longtime families in the state that have accumulated several 100,000 acres of land over the centuries or decades that they've been in the state, all the way down to landowners that might own 5 or 10 or 50 acres. And so really all of them are working to bring fire back on the landscape, whether it's a small family that owns 50 acres all the way up to the Weyerhaeuser. It's in everybody's best interest to get fire on the ground, and to do regular prescribed burning, is it helps for the timber investment organizations that they want the timber to grow big, and they want it to have good form, and they want it to grow fast. Fire helps with all that. So we work with all landowners, from Weyerhaeuser all the way down to small family landowners. And really everybody is working together to get fire back on the landscape. In terms of legislative or tax incentives, there's not any tax incentives, at least that I'm aware of, specific to prescribed fire. There are some property tax incentives we have in Georgia for forest land ownership. So timberland owners can get a tax break by owning timberland property and managing this timberland property. As part of that, they have to have a forest management plan. And so that forest management plan could, as part of the management plan, they could do fire every other year, every 3 years. But nothing that I'm aware of specific to tax incentives. And legislative incentives, the biggest one is that burn boss liability protection. So If you are certified, if you do everything right, and somehow fire does still manage to escape, you're not liable and you're not on the hook for that.
Thanks so much, Nick. Another question, what's something that we can do as everyday citizens to advocate for fire and promote awareness, and also protect those species that are declining?
I'm sorry, Nick, you're muted. When I was trying to allow other people to unmute themselves, I accidentally muted you.
All right.
Perfect.
How's that?
Thank
That's a good question, and one that I honestly probably haven't thought about. So, one way is just to, now that hopefully you're drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak. I mean, you can, kind of share with your network, your friends when you're sitting around, or your fellow Davidson classmates, and kind of share that fire is a good thing, and that there are a lot of organizations out there, GFF, my foundation being one of them, but there's a lot of groups kind of across the state that are, or across the Southeast, that are working on this and restoring fire to the landscape. So, we're a nonprofit. We rely 100% on donations for support. There's other similar groups out there doing the same thing. So Longleaf Alliance is a big one that works all across the Southeast and the historical range of longleaf. The Nature Conservancy, which is who I interned with in grad school, they do a lot in terms of fire across the Southeast. And so, depending on where you are, and you can feel free to shoot me a note and follow up with me directly, but there probably are organizations wherever you are in the country that are focused on fire and helping restore fire to the landscape that would probably appreciate your support.
Thank you so much, Nick. I definitely feel inspired. Anyone else have any other questions they would like to ask Nick? You can unmute yourself if you'd like. All right.
All right. Well, if that's it, thank you so much, Nick, for taking the time to speak with us today and leading us in conversation. I also want to extend a big thank you to the Class of 2008 Reunion Committee for sponsoring this event. Do note that this event was recorded and will be available on the website in a week or so. And thanks to all of you for joining us today, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night.
Go Cats!
Shout out to Rebecca and Maddie for joining. Thanks, y'all.